Howdy, 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 everyone. Welcome to the ComicBase live stream. I'm your host, Pete Bickford, and for, well, maybe not quite an hour, we'll be talking about, well, all things comics and ComicBase, really, but in particular this time out, the lovely topic, which I so enjoy, that of professionally graded or slabbed comics and all the fun that brings to the comic market. But anyway, before we get into it too much, I do have a couple quick announcements. There is a new build of ComicBase. 2024 is just out merely moments before the show. It's build 1208. It fixes some interesting, weird little stuff. One of our users in Sweden actually figured out that if you type the Hulk, just HULK, and then very, very quickly backspaced 5 times exactly, so he was backspacing more than it had, he could actually throw the type select off and get throw it into a bit of a loop. So that's been fixed, and thank you to I believe was it Peter Svensson. Anyway, but thank you to the people who pointed that one out. We really appreciate it. We also change around some different preferences, and the other thing that this build does is it's a roll up for all the other little tweaks, changes, and updates that we've done since the start of the ComicBase 2024 cycle. It'll probably be, and I'm not committing to this 100%, but probably when you see it tomorrow, it will probably release it as build 2024.1. It'll be our first official forced release because as we're pulling into the cycle, we're starting to work on the next one. We have had a surprisingly stable run for ComicBase 2024, but I did want to get everyone up on the same build just as we head into the next version, just so we're always talking apples to apples when whenever we're talking on the phone about different things people are doing with the program. So look for that. No need to download it right now unless you just really got to have the latest thing directly. But it'll probably, like I say, be warned that when you download your next update, it'll probably say there's a build 2024.1 out there that you will need to download before you can download new content updates. Anyway, before we get into it too bad, I just want to say hi to the folks here. Rich Scott and Fabian of Andries over in Belgium cannot make it here tonight. Gregor Hector, our moderator, is in the house, as is Xanadu Comics and Ed. And I'm sure other people will pop in as we go. It may be that just my enthusiasm for the subject today is just contagious. We'll see. But anyway, we'll talk about that in just a second. So what we're going to be doing today, for the most part, is casting our mind back to those halcyon days of 2005. Ah, yes. So ComicBase, as you guys might know, started in 1992. And those days, they had barely invented the silver cover, much less the chromium one. 0 issues, I don't believe, had come along yet. A million issues were yet to follow that year. Half issues were being done by Wizard, but no one had thought yet to do a -1, -2, or -3 issue. Thank you, Wizard. A Pi issue. Thank you. Oh, good Lord, who was that? It wasn't. Who did? I forget. It was an indie comic decided. We're gonna have issue number Pi. Malibu followed up with issue number Infinity for a few of their ones later on. But it was variants were few and far between. They were so rare that you could actually give them descriptive names like this is the gold cover edition or the silver ink edition. We didn't have to just label them like Excel spreadsheet coordinates like we do today. I believe the average comic book at the time was going for somewhere around $1. Correct me on that one if I'm wrong, folks. But yes, it was a lovely, lovely era. And just to kind of paint the mood just a little bit there, the top 100 songs of the year, we had Best of You by the Foo Fighters, Shine Down with Save Me, Nickelback doing Photograph, who else do we have this on there? Gorillaz had just formed up, Blur apparently just broken up, Feel Good Incorporated was on the chart, Audio Slave was hitting, Seether, Green Day, Papa Roach, 9 Inch Nails was all over the charts, doing their follow-up to Pretty Hate Machine. I believe they're doing Hand That Feeds and so forth. Great stuff out there. By the way, and this is another thing that I would trade in a second for today's pop chart. I was looking at just before showtime, and it's a hellscape out there. But one thing that was happening in 2005 that I can only look at this as the days before, and with a certain amount of fondness back then, is that in 2005, a company called the Certified Guarantee Corporation decided to move from the realm of coins, where they're starting to make quite an impact for themselves, and start playing in the comics sphere. uh, where they introduced the rather novel concept to us all at the time that, well, you guys are all starting to sell books online, and sometimes you buy from, people who haven't pointed out all the retouches and all the phony baloney grading and things like that. And some people, sometimes you got into quite a fight about, was this thing in VF plus or VF or VF minus even, and they wouldn't tell you about that, slight tear on page 12 of the issue and so forth. And into this whole thing, the Comics Guarantee Corporation promised that if you would send your comics over to them for a modest, fee, amounting to something like $25, and later on adding, I believe, 1% of the final value of the book. I think that came along later, but anyone who's done this more than me can, correct me on that one. But they would do something rather remarkable we hadn't seen before, is they would take your comic book, have some people, and they made a big show in the early days, especially, of hauling this ginormous safe around to different shows, where people wearing film handling gloves, white, film handling gloves, would very carefully, with a jeweler's loop or a magnifier, would review painstakingly every page of the comic book, and then make some notations of themselves, and eventually a label would roll off a printer with a giant, like, 9.0, along with any grading notes about what exactly was wrong with your comic book. And your comic book, along with this big label, would be slabbed forever. It would be stamped inside plastic, in a fused down way, so that you could never open it and disturb the grading, in a plastic holder, they called it. But and you would know forever that your copy of whatever the heck it was, number 4, was a 9.0, and also it gained a certain amount of sturdiness in the process. You could literally take that thing and wrap it on the desk if you wanted to. Not that you would, because it suddenly became a very valuable thing, having been slabbed into this sort of thing. The one thing you could never do after that moment, however, unfortunately, was read the comic. But there was a small price to pay, most people seem to feel, where after an initial period of people regarding this whole process with a great deal of suspicion and confusion, an interesting phenomena came to be, which was, and the CGC themselves would take out ads in the Comics Buyer's Guide, with contrasting this, is that you could take issues of the same comic book, say a Vampirella magazine number 1, and it would go for, say, $400 in near mint condition. But then if you put it in one of their holders and you would slab it, and it would say CGC 9.4, which means, strangely enough, near mint, that suddenly it would go for, say, $2,000 when these things were sold on eBay. I'm not remembering the exact numbers here, so don't hold me to those ones, please. But they would take a series of ads out in Comics Buyer's Guide and elsewhere, where they would prove that what they were doing there was essentially turning your comic book, no matter how honestly you were grading it, into something that was much more well regarded in the marketplace, that a whole bunch of people, maybe who weren't even comic book folks, would suddenly be interested in buying. And you treat these things almost more like stocks and bonds then, rather than comic books. They really became a new collectible. And initially, when at that point, we were working very closely with the folks at Comics Buyer's Guide, and all of us, we're looking at this thing going like, what the hell? Wait, so I'm going to send this to these guys, they're going to grade it, like we couldn't learn how to grade ourselves even, but they're going to grade it, and after that we can't read the comic. That's the deal. And I remember Maggie Thompson at the time saying, yeah, but watch out, this thing's going to take over the industry, because we've already seen this thing happen with coins, and it's going to come through here like a bandsaw. And she was absolutely right. We are now almost 20 years on, and the whole idea of taking your collectibles and minting them into a whole brand new Magic collectible, which is encased in plastic with a big, bright, shiny seal on the front, it has become a $1 jillion industry for not only Comics Guarantee Corporation, they're certainly the main players in this one, but also a number of also follow-on guys. This has, this idea of professional grading has certainly become de rigueur in a number of other collectible fields, but in comics, it's absolutely transformative because unlike, say, a coin or a baseball card or many of the postcard or many of the things that would had been graded and slabbed in previous days, uh, you could flip over a coin holder and see both sides of the coin, and it probably, if you're talking about a rare Roman coin or something like that, it probably was a relief to you that there was no way that you could like mess up the coin by touching it with the oils in your hands and things like that and devalue it over time. Maybe you felt the same way about your Hank Aaron rookie card that they were doing there, because I mean there's nothing that kept you from fully enjoying the card itself. I mean, you weren't going to take your Hank Aaron rookie card and wad it up and stick it in the spokes of your bicycle at that point. I mean, that's not who this field was for. But yeah, it was definitely something new. The idea that we're going to take a collectible that, in a fundamental way, can't be enjoyed as the collectible anymore. When you start talking about comic books, and later on they started doing magazines, and they've done other things since then. But I think comic books is where they've really had the most impact. Now, that was all. 2005 was when they opened for business and the whole thing. Since that day, and their main grader at that guy was a guy by the name of Steve Borak. A guy with some heft in the comic industry. People definitely, he was definitely a source of credibility for the whole thing, and they definitely leaned into the what the Germans would call the Schauspiel, the show business of the whole thing. I mean, it cost a fair amount of drayage to haul a jillion-ton banker safe. It was like an old banker, the sort of thing you'd almost see like in a Wild West, for cowboys robbing the thing. But they would haul that from show to show, and they really made a big point about the the magnifying loops and the white gloves and things like that. Especially in the early days, they would be some of the only people at the comic show who were dressed up in three-piece suits. Inevitably, I think I'm making up three-piece. I think it was two-piece suits. But if you saw a well-dressed guy at a comic show, they were almost certainly with one of the great the grading companies. But they became very successful. And of course, after a while, Steve Borak in 2008, who was the head grader and I believe the founder of the comics end of CGC, felt that he wanted to move on to other adventures, which is generally a cue for saying I'm not feeling appreciated enough where I am. And he went off to first, he became a grader over at Heritage Auctions, over there, running their division, division for consignment. And then later on, he went off and founded a competing organization called the Comic Book Certification Service, or CBCS. He founded that in 2014. Ironically, just found out in 2022, after COVID had ripped through the universe, he left and joined my comic shop as a senior consignment director. So he's not at CBCS anymore either. But they definitely broke open the whole industry and became the most accepted brands in the whole thing. CGC completely dominating the field of grading in the comics field. CBCS, I think largely based on the pedigree of Steve Borak himself, also has a fair amount of credibility, if not the same kind of brand homogeneity of CGC these days. Now, anytime you're going to start a service in any economy where it looks like you're basically printing money, which is what this kind of came down to, you're going to find other folks who say, wait a minute, so what I got to do in order to get on this game, let me see if I follow, is I got to have a laser printer that can print a big label. I got to say I can grade comic books for you, and I got to have a thing that seals these things inside plastic slabs. That's the table stakes to get in. Oh, okay, got it. So later on, a company called Professional Grading Experts came in. They're headquartered out of Eugene, Oregon. Their website's a little confusing. I first encountered them well after CGC was in the market, and their website is a bit conflicty on when they started. They say started in 2002, which would have put them 3 years before GC. But simultaneously, it also says we're now proudly celebrating 15 years in business, which if I deduct 15 years from 2024, which is the current year, I don't get 2002. So, who knows? But like I say, my first run-in with PGX was considerably later in the game. And then the latest entry that we've seen is the Expert Grading Service, EGS, who started in 2018. All of the later guys, again, are offering the similar kind of promise. We're basically going to take your collectibles, we're going to professionally grade them and slab them, and they become something else. They all services, as well, to my knowledge, are also have figured out that, well, if we're not making enough, bank off of just people sending in their books along with a fee, and later on the fee was not just originally there'd be like a modern book fee. The theory being that, well, modern books aren't that chewed up, they're less likely to be restored, they'd require less care, we can get through them pretty quickly. That was the original discussion on why modern books should be less to grade, or for that matter, that golden age books should be much more expensive to grade than modern books. All the companies, to my knowledge, have different fee structures, which say if it's a modern book, we'll do it more cheaply. Later on, they introduced the idea that we're not just going to charge you like $250 to do a golden age book, but we're also going to add in, say, 1% of the Overstreet price guide value of that book, just as a sweetener, because we feel it's our due. I'm gonna leave it to all those companies to justify how that is a rational basis for grading. But hey, so it goes. But at some point, you've graded most of the valuable old books there out in the market, and companies always want to gain revenue. So all the services have also, to my knowledge, gotten invested in a number of other sidelines. Among these sidelines are, they will, first of all, they start out with, we're not just going to flag your books for restoration and things like that, and tell you, hey, here's where a guy pulled a fast one on you with a ballpoint pen and tried to touch up that color defect. But we'll actually kind of incorporate them into our business model. We'll say, okay, well, it's a restored grade, so it's not just the real grade it pretends to be. We're going to say, well, if the restoration was legit, then it would have been this grade. So you can get restored grades, so restored CGC grade 8.5 as opposed to a CGC 8.5, meaning that it really is that grade. They have also gotten into the idea of, we will run our own cleaning and pressing services. It's kind of like dry cleaning for your comic books, but if you're a comic purist on the whole thing, the whole idea of restoration is it's legit. I mean, restoration is when you're adding stuff or taking away stuff from a comic book. If there was if you could somehow get away with retrimming the comic book and taking a 1/16 of an inch of it, and in the process you would be sharpening up a bunch of corners that had been blunted, or getting rid of some edge tears and things like that, that's it's within the realm of restoration, but it's not considered legitimate because you took something away. Similarly, if you were to go and replace the staples, if you had staple rust and you put in fresh new shiny staples as opposed to the rusted ones, or you somehow came in there with a glue solution and started doing a little surgery on the edges of something that was taped in, or if in the more extreme cases, if you went in there with a ballpoint pen or some other kind of touch up and did either color or other touching on the whole thing to kind of fill in the little cracks and holes that developed in comic books over time, that's considered restoration, and it's not. You're kind of changing the article at that point, so it's not as legit. There is a more legit form of things. It's not considered restoration, which is the idea that I'm simply going to take the comic book and I'm going to clean it up. I'm going to you can essentially dry clean a comic book. You can get rid of the dirt to a certain extent, but more importantly, if you're very patient and you've got either a very big press, or more commonly, it's something that looks a lot like a t-shirt press, if you guys have seen those. But you can take a tiny amount of moisture in the air, combined with a fair amount of pressing force, and if you have minor bends and crinkles and things like that in the cover, you can often, and if your pressing guy knows what he's doing, straighten those out, because you're basically just restoring the paper to its original form before it was marred by the whatever happened to it over its life. Pressing and cleaning are not considered restoration. They're considered, because again, you didn't take anything away from the original comic book. Taking away dirt doesn't count, apparently, and you didn't add anything. So all the major services also operate their own pressing services. So why not be the one-stop shop that not only can you get a grade from us, but you can send it through our guys who will then press it and then grade it. And I'm sure there's no incentive for those guys to ever alter the grade from what you would get if you simply sent the book in and did not indulge their other services. Um, but that's a thing. Another thing that came down the line is the idea of signed books. Now, you can always take a book and get it signed, and it was always a bit ambiguous as to whether that even helped the value. If I had a copy of Youngblood and I got the second assistant inker on to scribble on it at a comic show, there's a kind of an open question as to whether or not that would just be considered actually a defect on the book because, hey, some jerk wrote on this, as opposed to whether anyone actually cares about getting, Joe Bob, Stanislavski's signature. Now, obviously, there are some signatures that carry some weight. If you were to get, if you had a copy of Spider-Man signed by Stan Lee, a great number of people would like that one quite a bit more than if it was not signed by Stan Lee. Same thing goes for any other great comic greats, especially the dead ones. Siegel and Shoot, sorry, tripping over my head here. I mean, if you had a Batman signed by Bob Kane, if you had Superman signed by Siegel and Schuster, anything like that, that would be fantastic. Bill Finger signing your copy of the Joker. But and obviously those guys are gone now. In the latter day of these grading services, all of them are also, to my knowledge, or at least trying to, or thinking of having their own signing events. CGC does quite a good business of this at this point, where they'll take folks who played the characters that the book is based on TV shows, who will then sign your copy of Doom Patrol or whatever else. They had nothing to do with the comic book. They just played a character that was shown in the comic book. And so, okay, so, Billy Joe, whoever the heck, who played, Cyborg or something on your copy of Teen Titans, he, for a mere $200, they'll give you a signature 9.8 copy of the book with his signature on it, and they will certify that that really is his signature. Because, God knows, otherwise you could have gotten that thing signed by anybody. And in fairness, the maddening thing about all this stuff is there is a bit of truth at the heart of all of it. And I do want to acknowledge that. I mean, if you guys are getting that my tongue is in my cheek a lot when I'm talking here, then you're definitely reading the show properly. But there is a bit of something at the beginning that justifies why you would want a grading service. Just like there are people who would sit there and say, well, if I get out my ballpoint pen, touch up a few panels on this old issue here, it takes it from a $5,000 issue to a $15,000 issue. A lot of people would be tempted to do that. And you want someone who can tell you that restoration was done. Similarly, it's estimated at one point that something like 70 or 80% of all the sports collectibles that you see on eBay are fakes. You just get a football, you get a baseball, you get a poster or whatever else, you scroll something, this is O.J. Simpson's signature. Who's to say it isn't? And you can obviously sell the autographed version for quite a bit more than you can the other way. There is something to be said for saying, no, we actually hosted this guy and we had him sign a bunch of things. We have our guy watching him like a hawk. And yes, that's definitely the one that he just signed there, which we then stuck into one of our sealers and, priced up, to the gills and sold to you. And of course, one of the great, things of any big printing money business arrangement like this is you want to make sure that all your collaborators get paid. Right. So you want to make sure, obviously the guarantee corporations or the slabbers are going to get paid. If you are the artist who is, you don't need to be hot. You just need to be a guy. But, hey, I had a run on The Flash back, well after anyone cared. And I was the artist on, the cover artist on The Flash for a while. Okay, fine. Get me to come on by. I will sign 1,000 copies of whatever the latest thing is here. We'll sell them for $200 off each. The grading company gets paid. I get a piece of the action, whole thing. And what the other part of it all is that as the buyers of all these things, just like those old ads they used to run in Comics Buyer's Guide, you think I'm going to get rich off this one as well, because if it's my copy and you want me to, you'll pay me one price to witness the signature. You'll pay me a different price to get one that you provide straight to me. It's already graded and things like that. But I'm thinking that, okay, if I add up all my costs to get the thing, to take the comic in there, to send it over to these guys, to get it graded and everything else, that I'm still going to, double my money if I can get this thing to come back in a certain grade with a certified signature or whatever else on the whole thing. Everyone's always thinking, yeah, I'm going to get paid in the end. And so it rolls on. Now, this is the state of play today. And, if you think back to 2005, Pete and, Brent Frankenoff and Maggie Thompson and John Jackson Miller all sitting around with Comics Buyer's Guide, looking at this thing in horror, thinking, oh God, we do not like the shape of this world to come. You'd have it about right. Because again, it's like comics were these things that, you opened up, you loved, you fell in love with the characters, you cherished, if you had a really good copy, sometimes you'd have a reading copy, which is the one you would actually get out to read and keep the other one in Mylar or something, but the idea of like just removing it from your own use, it was completely alien. Well, it's 20 years later now. And because there has been this kind of printing money effect, a number of things have happened. I'll get to that in a minute. The thing I want to say is, if you look at the comic, so the Comic Buyer's Guide guys are looking at saying, man, this is really going to suck a lot of the fun out of our industry. This won't be great. I'm sure the ad guys are sitting there thinking, well, maybe we could sell a bunch of ads. That's cool. But I'm looking at this from a grading standpoint saying, okay, so let me get this straight. You and I can agree on the price of a copy of Spawn #1. I say it's $10. You say it's $10. You say it's near mint. I say it's near mint. And I get my $10 and I'm getting ready to hand it to you. But you say, whoa, wait a minute. I can go get it slabbed and suddenly it's not a $10 comic anymore. Suddenly it's a $40, $50, $80, $100 comic book. And I'm thinking, what kind of sense does this make? I can be sympathetic for the idea that, like, if I'm buying a $10,000, copy of Tales from the Crypt, or Action number 5 or something like that, I could definitely see paying some insurance money essentially to make sure I'm not getting ripped off here. But if I'm going to take a modern comic book, I'm going to get slabbed and it turns into another kind of collectible that charts and trades and it is considered much more valuable simply because of the presence of the slab. Yeah, I'm like, you got to be kidding me. No, who's going to keep going for this? Well, we are now 20 years later, and people obviously did keep going for it. So we did a large study back in the day, primarily John Jackson Miller over at Comics Buyer's Guide, basically took a large sample of eBay books where we could determine what the book was with some certainty before and after. What the slabbing process was getting. And we found some extraordinary stuff. We found that basically near mint books, were, as soon as they were slabbed and they were turned into CGC 9.4, they were on average about 4 times more valuable. But the break even was about very fine, CGC 8.5, where after that point, they didn't really pick up much value at all. But if for the higher grades, it got really extraordinary because there was a new kind of collector class out there. And maybe they'd been there all along and just didn't have a way of voicing themselves, where they didn't want just the near mint copy. Matter of fact, there was some kind of crazy interest in having the best known copy of all time. If you saw these guys in your comic shop, they'd be the guys on New Comic Day flipping through the stack of all the new releases and holding it up this way and that in the light and checking the spine and things like that and putting half of them back after they fumbled all over them and messed them up. And eventually they take the one copy of Ghost Rider up to the front of the cabinet and the guy at the counter would be like, dude, really? You messed up all my Ghost Riders. Thanks a lot, man. Get out of my shop. Anyway, those guys, were very interested in buying books that were marked above near mint. So as soon as you got to like CGC 9.6 or 9.8, or God help you, 10.0, 10.0 meaning perfectly free of all defects. Suddenly, there were these crazy jackpot percentages being paid out in the market. Especially if you say you take a Wolverine #1, which I think at the time was like a $30 comic book, and you'd find it going for like $600 as a 10.0. It was absolutely nuts. You sit there, but wait, I mean, this is a comic book that over 100,000 were printed. It's 10.0. Yeah, okay, it's a really nice copy, but is it 28 times better? And the answer, at least for several years, again and again, was yeah, people are willing to pay it. And it drove me crazy. I mean, I'm sitting there again, just like I looked at variants and I was hoping people sober up at some point. It'll go away, right? But it didn't go away. Now, we took the early data from what we got on that big survey, and we fed that into ComicBase. When we started supporting the CGC grades explicitly, we fed that into a percentage of near mint calculation. It's in the table. So if we go over to ComicBase here, pull that up just for a second. If you were to come in under the setup menu and you go to grading, that's where you can see that there's grades, and then there's the condition, the abbreviation, and then what percentage of near mint they respond to. And so, for instance, near mint's obviously 100% of near mint. Near mint minus would be 90% of near mint. Very fine is only about 2/3 as good as a near mint copy, and so forth. These are all numbers that are kind of been accepted, through the years back in the old days. By the way, this mint one, consider this one as current as of the year 2005, because ever since then, the people who are looking for that, the mint copy, they're not paying a little bit more for it. Now, what they're doing is they're going down and getting it graded as slabbed, because if you get it slabbed, then suddenly you have these kind of grades. That a 10.0 copy, like an actually mint one, is 28 times more than the near mint copy on the market. A 9.9. I don't know what you would even consider that as. It's so mint, but maybe a stray beam of sunlight, colored it at one point, or someone looked at it funny. But that one still gets you 2,600% of the other. CGC 9.8, for all practical purposes, it's a perfect comic book. These CGC 9.8s are interesting because I would expect if I were paying for the print job that anything that rolled off the press that I paid for would start at least CGC 9.8. But there's also a really interesting phenomenon when you look at the distribution of grades that are actually given out by the different grading companies, where there's actually a suspiciously small number of 10.0s given out. 9.8s you can get pretty easily. 9.6 is definitely, 9.4 is, and so forth. But one would look at the breakdowns of brand new comic books brought to them for grading, or that even provided straight from the manufacturer for grading, and question why so few were getting the top grades. One might almost suspect that there was something to be said for constraining the supply of the jackpot grades. And when you're talking about the 9.8s and above, you're talking about a jackpot grade, 12 times the value, the market value of what a near mint would bring. So this stuff has been going on, and by the way, you can see that as soon as you get down below 9, but below 9.4, you're starting to kind of take it in the neck a little bit when you start also factoring your own fees on these things. So it does not make sense to take a copy of, New Mutants #3 or something like that, $10 comic book, try to get it graded, pay the money for the whole thing and say, oh, yay, good news, it's now worth $12. And say, but I paid $20 to get it graded. So, people will definitely sift these things. They used to offer services at some of them for a while. I don't know if they still do, where they would, for a certain amount of money, they would pre-screen your books and say, well, yeah, you sent me in a big pile here. We think of the 50 you sent us, 30 of them are likely to come back 9.6 or above, and so we'll charge you a screening fee, but then we'll actually charge you the fee for having actually graded the other ones. That was again, I don't know if they still do that, but that was in the early days certainly something that was of interest. The game that arose on the whole thing was definitely call it dross into gold, is that I'm going to take my books, and it's not typically the really, really exceptional books. And I know that, if I sort them carefully enough, especially if I played some games and with pressing and things like that, that I could get them graded and turn them into something I could sell for quite a bit more. Lather, rinse, and repeat times a lot of comic books, and people have made a lot of money trading CGC books, online and so forth. Whole auction houses have arisen simply to trade only graded books, and that was kind of phase one of the whole thing. And phase two of the whole thing, and that's the part. This is the part that I didn't get at all, and I honestly, I'm going to say, we were far too slow to react to. Is while I could look at the people selling low-end books for crazy multiples of what they should be going for by getting them graded, and especially getting these jackpot grades back, I was sitting there for most of it saying, well, we did our part. We don't really play in the slabbed area ourselves. We've got some numbers we throw it at you. If you're in that area, you're obviously an expert yourself. You're on your own. We'll give you a ballpark estimate of where things are worth. But if you're playing in this kind of speculative market, you should really be doing your own pricing. This is not what a price guide is good at. And anytime you're going to take a price, that someone gives you and multiply it by hundreds of percent in order to get to the right price or the market price, the price guide is of very limited value. I'll be the first one to tell anyone that. And I've certainly told enough people that over the years. But like I say, in my heart of hearts, I'm kind of just hoping the whole thing goes away. The thing I did not see coming is that while you had all the day traders, speculating their butts off with, the CGC 9.6s and 9.8s and all the stuff of the relatively common comic books. And yes, when we're talking about a Dazzler #1, it's a common comic book. Or for that matter, anything they printed more than about, anything where there's more than about 5,000 surviving near mint copies today is a relatively common comic book. Anyone who really wants one can get one. But what I didn't see coming is that over time, the people who had uncommon comic books, so starting with the action #1s, the action number, for that matter, 100s or 500s, that those would all get graded. Because once you got it graded, once you put it in the slab, there were some pretty well publicized times when someone I got my action #4, I got it graded, it came back as a 7.5. I'm like, you suck. It's at least an 8.5, and what people would sometimes do is they'd crack the slab open, wait a few months, send it back again, and get a different grade. Which again, Mr. Comic engineer guy over here is looking at that saying, wait a minute, you've got a grading system that is essentially indicating to people that I can grade things down to 1/10 of a point. That's the whole idea of a decimalized point, X system. The reality I've seen is that in real comic book stores, you're likely to get it to have people hit a whole overstreet grade. We did not typically play with the VF pluses and the VF pluses, the near mint minuses and all that stuff. We've seen it done, but it's rare when you're dealing with people in the unslabbed days to be able to have two people agree on the grade. Just someone who was just honest enough going by the guide, where you weren't taking the book back later and saying, hey man, I opened this thing up and come on, the grade you had on the cover is nowhere near. By the way, shout out to Lee from Lee's Comics, absolute star in this regard. Never bought a book from him in all my years that was not perfectly graded, and that was well before slabbing. So Lee, if you're listening to this one, kudos to you, man. There are other people who do that one, but then there are also people you deal with where like, yeah, okay, I like this guy's got good selection, but his grading is off by at least half a grade, and everyone would know it, and that's just the way the market would work back in the day. But what was happening over time, so after a decade of this being the only way that you could transact high-end books, is anyone who had a high-end book and wanted to sell it, and if you did, you only had two ways of selling it. You could sell it in person at a show, right? So here I've got my copy of Action Comics #4. It's in I think it's in VF condition, so that makes an 8.5. You can carefully look at it, or I will carefully open it up to you and then show you it page by page and let you examine it. And then we dicker a little bit over the price, and then a lot of money would change hands, and then someone would walk home with the book. That's the way this stuff would typically go. As recently as say 6-7 years ago, that was I'd say I saw more sales like that at Comic-Con than not. Nowadays, what has happened is, because once the books get thrown into the plastic, they almost never get taken out of the plastic, because as soon as you take them out of the plastic, you've you're back at square one. You've got to pay to get them graded again. You've got to, you've destroyed most of the market value that the plastic had connoted, unless you think that somehow you can get lucky and somehow clean the book up again, or just get lucky sending it back. Typically you left the books in the holders. And by the way, for anyone, I know I have a couple listeners on here who are actually the crazy guys who, for insurance purposes, will go get it graded just so they get properly insured, and then crack it open so they can read it and then stick it in Mylar. And to all those people, I just say, bless you all. You're keeping you're keeping the hobby alive. But most people didn't. And for them, what happens then is, there may only be several dozen copies of Action Comics #4 in any kind of decent shape in the world. Action Comics #5, so forth. I mean, there are comic books that are legitimately hard to find. Like I know someone who at one point had a full set of every DC comic book published up and through the I want to say I met her in the around 2000, but through that point she had a list and it had like 17 or 18 empty spaces on it of every DC comic book that had ever been published, and she's like 17 or 18 books she was looking to fill in. There are people like that, God bless them. And it used to be that you'd go to Comic-Con, and if you could fill 2 or 3 items off that list, that was a big show. What's happening though more and more is, because all the copies of, say, Action Comics #4 have now been slabbed, the one thing you won't find for them anymore is you won't find them in unslabbed shape, period. It becomes a non-item. And so with ComicBase, we've got this weird phenomenon now where we track, essentially, we're trying to guide everything off of what's the near mint price of this book, and then we try to interpolate what would it be in other grades. If the only way an Action Comics #4 even exists is in a slabbed shape of one sort or another, well, first of all, you have 2 things. First of all, it gets really weird trying to figure out what the near mint equivalent price would be, because these typically are subject to high multiples depending on their grade one way or another. They're typically are very high dollars one way or another. And the only way the sale is ever transacted is at an auction of a slabbed book. And so in a way, the idea of talking about it near mint is almost like a distraction. Now, it gets really weird when you start talking about, especially during COVID, we saw these multi-million-dollar sales for 6.5 copies of Action Comics #1. And then every time one of these would come up for auction, and the same, they call it the rocket copy of Action Comics #1, because the kid who had this copy had a little, one of those little rubber stamps with a rocket on it, and just thought it looked cool. There's a rocket on the cover. I'll take my rocket, stamp it, stamped it on the cover too, and that way everyone will know it's my copy anyway. And you take a pretty good shape of it. But this thing came up for auction, I believe, 3 times during COVID. It was crazy. It was coming about every 3-4 months or so, and every time it would come up and it would sell for 300,000 or 400,000 more than the last time. But also every time it would come for sale and things like it, suddenly there'd be a staff meeting at ComicBase where we'd have to sit there and say, okay, well, yeah, all right, a 9.0 copy of The Amazing Fantasy #15 just came up for sale, and it just sold for however many millions of dollars. We would typically say that 9.0, you'd be multiplying it by 160% to get at, with the near mint values, which means you should be dividing it by 1.6 by 1/1.6 to get to its near mint value ungraded. But at that point the number's wildly off. I mean, it's because what was happening is just the table stakes for playing at that end of the market were that the book be slabbed. I mean, if Heritage Comics, if you have a great collection and you want to, cash out, it's time to buy yourself that vacation home in Florida or whatever you want, you can go in ComicBase, go to the internet menu, say request collection evaluation, and it will pre-screen your collection to see if it's the kind of thing that Heritage Comics even wants to pay attention to. It'll looking for a certain number of books worth a certain amount of money, and if so, it'll put a pressy of them along with essentially it routes your stuff straight to the acquisitions desk of the guy over at Heritage who takes on collections. They will, if necessary, get a guy on a plane and fly him out and take your books and see what you've got. And if they like it, the very first thing they will do, if they're not done already, is get them slabbed. It's just the table stakes, because they know that when it comes up for auction, if I say I've got a copy of Very Amazing Fantasy number 15, and it's ungraded, it's going to sell for nothing like, or at the very least, it'll be a lot more nervous to buy than if I can get the thing and it says, oh yeah, it came back in 8.5 condition or 9.0 condition, just something with a number on it. You're going to have a lot more bidders, you're going to have a lot more people transacting the business. It's going to sell much more easily. And so merely the table stakes for even transacting the sale involve the slabbing. And so what's happening now is we're getting to the point where we analyze, we get sent, auction data from Heritage every week. And, okay, it'll come back, okay, this one was sold for X amount in, CGC 9.0 or 8.5 or whatever else. And we'll be running the numbers backwards. And then we have to kind of do the thing we hate doing most of all. We have to kind of put our thumb on the scale a little bit and say, well, yeah, and we know that, the thing would, our numbers say the percentage of near mint, that this thing would, its near mint equivalent price as estimated by running the numbers backwards in the program would be this. But because we know it's a big, heavy, expensive book, and that's the only way it would have been sold, we know the real number is much closer to just the raw auction price. We don't actually apply the same multiples, especially for the multi-million-dollar sales. I mean, those ones are almost like an independent discussion every time about figuring out what the near mint price should be in ComicBase. So what it kind of comes down to, and this is all a very long way of getting there, is after 20 years of CGC and the like in the market, you basically have two factions that have broken out. One of which I could almost say, yeah, do your thing. You're the experts. You're the day traders. Speculate as best you can. We'll give you broad guidance, but then to heck with you. And that's like the day. Think about it as the low value guys. The guys are going to take a copy of Titans United #1, get it slabbed, get it signed, or whatever else they want. Sell it for however much on eBay. Lather, rinse, and repeat a million times. That's one market. And we are still seeing weird jackpotty multiples attached to very high-end books and things like that. But on the other end of things, when you go to the far end of things, like the Action Comics #1s, where it's going to transact a sale price in the millions, at that point, the price is almost just the price. It's the slab itself is connoting very little of the value. So in other words, if I knew the thing was it was in let's say near mint condition, and it sold for $6.8 million, I don't then divide by 4 to get the unslabbed price. No, I would divide by a small number. I might divide by 1.2 to get the unslabbed price of what that book would have brought. It's a much smaller number than I would apply if I were talking about a low value book. And that is a market that we're not getting away from ever. It's literally, CGC has converted the market at this point. I say CGC as a shorthand for saying CGC, CBCS, PGX, EGS, all of them together. So the high-end comic book market simply is a slabbed market at this point. It's rare to see an unslabbed copy to come by. And so one thing that's become very clear to us over time, and we kind of walked up the edge of dealing with it earlier in an earlier release, and then I got scared, and I pulled the plug at the last minute. And I said, well, let's back off and rethink a little bit. But it was clear to us what we needed is we couldn't just have one set of gradings for high-end books. The idea of you couldn't just have a percentage of near mint and say that this applies equally well to a $10,000 copy of Marvel Tales and a $10 copy of Dazzler. It just doesn't work that way. The market doesn't bear it out at all, and the percentages just look ridiculous, honestly. We had coped with it, I think, reasonably well by adding a lot of exception kind of logic into our processing, in terms of throwing out things that tended to involve wild multiples and stuff like that. And but really, the time has more than come for us to take a more sober look at how we handle high-end books, or for that mean, high-end being defined as probably like $100 or more, as well as mid-end books, and when you're playing the CGC game on them. So this is all a very lengthy preamble, which comes down to the idea that what you really kind of want to do, at least as a way of doing much more to the point modeling of what the market is telling us about what these books are doing, is you do apply something like the standard scale. And we might even want to back that off a bit because the market's a bit more mature. We're not seeing the 28 times multiples as frequently for the the key books as we used to. I'm not convinced it's completely gone away, but it's a harder one to pull off. But something like that does seem like it still applies to lower end books. Let's say books with a near mint value price of about $25 or around thereabout. So you can still take a copy of Spawn #1, which I think is in the guide now for $32. If that thing comes and gets CGC'd and comes back in 9.8, what does that say? So 12 times 32, that puts us like what, $3,600 book. I'm sorry, a $360 book. I think that's too high. Even for that kind of book. So that's a $32 book. If you're talking about Spawn #2 that maybe was going for $10, could it come back for 120? Yeah, it could. It's now outside the realm of possibility. But one thing that's definitely not happening is you can't take a copy of $500 book, picture like a nice copy of an Our Army at War with Sergeant Rock or something like that. You can't take that, get that to come back in a 9.6 and have it come back at 6 times its price. It just doesn't happen. A $600 book does not become a $3,600 book when you stick in the slab. But a $10 book might become a $60 book if you stick in the slab and you come back at at a 9.6. So what we were thinking initially was that the dividing line on this whole phenomenon was going to be, well, what's the market that CGC cares about? And CGC is very much a $500 and up kind of enterprise. Honestly, when you say $500, they're kind of doing you a favor at the $500 level. They're really interested at the $2,500 level. You have books that are over $2,500, then they definitely want to talk to you. If you got a bunch of $500 books, they might talk to you. But that's kind of the realm they play in. And our intuition originally was that, okay, let's apply one number that's for books over $500 and quite a bit more, one number for books under $500 and quite a bit more modest multiple for books over $500. And we were thinking something like, okay, so if CGC 9.4 near mint, right, is a 4x multiplier, that maybe for books over 500 we kick it down to 1.2 or something instead of 4.0. But what we quickly found out when we started running this through the data set is that, yeah, it's not the $500. That's not where the market flips on this stuff. It's much lower. It's really more like 100, maybe $50. And as we kind of played with the numbers together, we're kind of thinking that what we really need to do is we need to adopt a mid-tier grade as well. So think about on the high, in the traditional grade of things, we have a 4x multiplier at near mint. Apply that to books that, who have a near mint value of $25 or below. When you are talking about books between $25 and $100 in unslabbed near mint value, then I think you're talking about a number that's something like 2.2. 2.4 in that kind of range as far as what you'd get if you slabbed it. So now we're talking about our Spawn, our $32 copy of Spawn. If you slabbed a Spawn #1, $32, you slabbed it, you're going to get a number that's like between 60 and 80 for a 9.4. You'll get somewhat higher for a 9.6, 9.8, obviously, but you won't be seeing the kind of crazy multiples you'll be seeing higher up. And then later on, when you talk about a comic book that's worth more than $100, so trying to think of a $100 comic book off the top of my head. Sorry, just absolutely drawing a blank. Now let's just take a Walking Dead #1. It's worth a couple of grand, right? As soon as you're talking about a comic book above that point, then you're dealing with numbers that are much more like the kind of reverse auction multiples that we were playing with before. That like a near mint copy might be running at like a 1.2 multiple over the near mint price. A 10.0 copy might be running at something like a 2.4, 2.6 multiple, not a 2800% multiple, like it would be if it was a very cheap comic book. Now, with all this said, all this is, we're talking about very approximate modeling. There's other ways we could make the model more complicated, and God knows we will probably be tweaking that over time. But I do think what we're probably converging on is the idea of something like a 3-tier model for applying the basic CGC grades. Now, with that said, I've been talking for a great deal of time, and this would be a wonderful time to actually go to the actual chat over here and answer some questions for people, because I saw that there's a bunch of them have come in. So let's see what I can do here. All right, let's see here. Okay, so Greg is answering my question here about baseline comic prices in 2005. Marvel, DC, 225. They're up to 225 in 2005 already. Wow, I'm surprised. Huh. Okay, well, thank you, Comic-Con. And let's see here. Pete Craig asks, how is this a signed/slab comic noted in CB as universal label or as restored label? If it was, I would, so you have two questions there, and one of them I can answer, the other one I can't. So the question no one's been able to answer is, what's the signature worth? So if you know that it's really the grade, right, then at that point it's a universal grade. You would put in the regular CGC 9 point whatever it was. It's not restored because they weren't touching up the book by signing it. They were just signing it. The question I can't answer, and I don't think anyone really can, I think all these things essentially become unique at that point as soon as you've customized them by signing them or doodling on them or whatever, is what's the signature worth? I gotta tell you, no price guide is going to help you on that one. It's an absolutely personal decision. I've never seen a guide that could give you anything other than the broadest possible guidance on that. And like I say, some people's signature adds absolutely nothing. Some people's signature might even detract from it to this day, whether it's an authentic signature or not. On the other hand, there are other ones where, yeah, it's clear. Again, Stan Lee signing your copy of Spider-Man, that you're going to sell that thing for more than if he hadn't signed it. And having someone say that it was verified, it really was Stan Lee, as opposed to someone who just looked at his signature, got out a pen, and did their best impression of it. Yeah, that's probably worth something. But man, no guide's going to help you put a number on that one. Let's see. Steve Herring says, don't know if True 10 exists or how you can differentiate between 9.8 and 9.6. Yeah, it's kind of weird because there's even a 9.9 grade that they do. True 10s do exist. I kind of come back to the point a lot in that if I were buying the print run, and I've bought print runs of things, if I'm at the end of the print, the bindery area of, so when you roll things off of, 4-color presses, you got this ginormous Gutenberg press, and it's, picking up, picks up the sheets, runs them down there. It gets through binderies where they cut, trim, and staple it all together. At the bottom of the whole thing, right before, there's some guy, some press operator at the end. Back in the day, he would always have a cigarette dangling from his mouth. He was picking the things up with gloves and shoving them in boxes for shipping to you. That's usually the part where the guy who's going to pay the the bills for the print run is looking through random copies as they come off the whole thing. And if every single one of those damn things doesn't look right, I'm going to call halt on the press or the bindery or whatever part isn't working right, and say, hey, and I ain't paying for these. It's I would say 9.8 would be the minimum of any printer I would ever use twice. As far as the quality level that's coming off the press. Now, the idea that you would take the thing, I mean, again, there's so much more innocent days back in the ages of Foo, with the Foo Fighter back in 2005, where, I mean, the thought was that, well, okay, yeah, they might have been printed perfectly well, but along the way, everyone would abuse and, treat them badly and things like that. And so they would naturally degrade. So you wouldn't expect to see that many, that's why near mint became the standard for things, not mint. Actually, once upon a time, mint was the standard. We actually just changed the meaning over time. For the mint means absolutely perfect. But the idea is that, they would degrade through the distribution chain. The distribution chain for comic books at this point sometimes starts and ends between the printer and CGC. There might not be a second party involved. So the idea that they're paying for anything more than, less than 9.8s is, I'm just going to call shenanigans on it. But anyway, we'll say it goes. All right, so let's see here. Okay, lots of descriptions about grades. Steve says, would an extremely rare unslabbed comic action comic books be more formed than the unslabbed comic? If you can't tell, it's supposed to be a joke. It's funny. I love jokes that aren't jokes. So when we're trying to intuit what the proper breakdowns are for different books and different grades, one thing that's kind of interesting, let's flip back to the other screen here for just a sec. And that would be this one over here. So you'll notice something kind of interesting happens as you devolve down the grades. So basically, once you get down into the very goodish range and below, the CGC grades are the same or even worse than the unslabbed ones. And what it comes down to, and this applies as well as you move and you start into what would a mid value grade or a high value grade be on the whole thing, is there is a point where you've kind of destroyed the mystery of the whole thing, where until I slabbed it and I knew it wasn't going to come back any higher than VG, I could actually justify paying a little bit more because it might be better. But once you slabbed it, all hope is gone at that point. Whereas people will pay sometimes, especially in the lower grades, if they think that, I'm looking at the pictures on the whole thing, he's marking it as this thing, but I think it's really a little bit better. They will occasionally, by a little bit, but they will pay more below a certain point for the unslabbed copy. So it's an interesting phenomenon. All right, let's see here. Greg says, related question, not a joke for rare comics. The number of unslabbed copies dwindled. To what extent does the value of those rare copies rise because of scarcity? Yes and no. I think it's more of the the removing all doubt. It's like the joke about hey, it's better to keep your mouth shut and be thought an idiot than to open your mouth and remove all doubt. The same thing goes. It's like it's better to be thought that you're in bad condition and not be slabbed than to get slabbed and remove all doubt. But the other thing about that is you can always convert a slabbed comic back into an unslabbed comic. It requires a screwdriver and a bit of force. But all that happens is someone threw away their slabbing fee on that point. But so it goes. Wayne says, excuse me, the comic-based market value is so off from real-world values on everything that they mostly get from Atomic Gavin, Heritage, Auction Sales, linking partner, GP analysis, blah, blah, blah. Don't want to be too dismissive about that, Wayne. So here's for the people who don't know how we get values. So GP analysis is basically, that's just a list of everyone who ever sent things into the CGC. They say, well, this is how many we issued in this grade. That's it. That's all it is. It's just a count of people who sent books in. And so you could say, well, yes, there are rather less high grade copies of Action number 4, that they've seen than, other things. What ComicBase does, the way we get prices, is we just average the market. That's all we do. We take books that we can verify what book it was and what it sold in what grade, and we just run a rolling average. So you could say it's a little bit mind-bending to me to say you're off from the market value, because we literally just reporting the market value. And in particular, you can post books for sale at a given price, and it will, if there's a lot of people who are on generally the same page as you, it will encourage the price to float in that direction. But when a book actually sells at a given point, it kind of hard shoves it to be where that sales price was. And we have enough data. There's about 2.1 million points we crank every week on that, which give us that rolling average. Now, granted, for the comic market, there are literally 440 grades we track for 1.25 million comic books at this point. 2.1 million comic data points per week is nowhere near enough to give us a per grade breakdown of every comic book on the market. I mean, you'd need like 300 times that number to really have a individuated grade, which is why we're forced to intuit the in-between grades in particular. And also why we very much caution people to watch out for any time when you're dealing with jackpots on one end or the other. So in other words, if you're dealing with a book that is going to price in at 400, 600, 800% of a near mint thing, all I would tell anyone using that as a guide is, for God's sake, be careful. Yeah, because there's only so much a price guide can do when you're multiplying by hundreds of percent. But when you're starting to talk about things where there's a fair amount of data and the grades aren't way out there, no, actually, I think we got the best pricing on the market because we're literally just pricing the market. I think one thing that we've done a pretty bad job on is pricing the CGC market, partially because of our, honestly, my own feeling of just kind of yuck towards the kind of like the dross into gold game. I don't like it. It feels like a scam. It just feels like a scam we're all participating in. That's part of it. But the other thing about it is that I think we were late to the game about realizing that the market had converted the golden age market, that the slabbing game had gone in there. So we will definitely be re-examining, and that's what we're kind of sketching out here, a dramatically different analysis of how you would reverse price out a CGC sale or the price up a potential CGC sale when you're talking about high-end books or even mid-end books. While I still wouldn't tell you, that anything that involves multiplying by 100% or even then like that, I'm still going to tell everyone, be careful. Price guides are just price guides. We're doing the best we can, but it's all it is. We only have so much data, even though we have a hell of a lot more than anyone else. But if you're going to play on the ends of things, yeah, be careful. Use your own judgment. But I think we can be a hell of a lot closer than we've been about dealing with the books in between the action number ones and the Dazzler number ones. And so that's what we're kind of sketching out here. All right, let's see here. Do some back and forth on Slab. Some books say, okay. Oh, and Greg wants to point out, holy cow, it's PSA time already. Smash, please. And by the way, this is the whole thing, and I'm also kind of talked out. But please smash the like and subscribe, because if this is the sort of thing that's useful to you, it's the sort of thing that will cause YouTube to be able to tell people about this sort of thing. And also, please note that there is a message board here where you can suggest forums for the whole thing, as well as get links to Andre's amazing ComicBase cover catalog. And so I think that's about it. Let's see. Yes. And Greg as well. The moral from today's live stream: get your old copies of ComicBase slabbed and make tons of money, kiddo. Geez, I'm seeing what they're doing with old video games, and well, let's just say I'm keeping copies of my copy of ComicBase 1.0. Who knows? So we have file copies of everything, but no, it's a problematic thing. And the last thing I'm just going to briefly comment on, but I'm not going to get into greatly, is we talked about there being 4 different slabbing services currently playing in the field right now. They're not all equally well loved. CGC is clearly the big dog. They were the first to get going. They're kind of the standard from which everything else is measured. And one thing that's interesting is I was looking at our code for how we reverse out pricing and things like that is, if you guys have ever been programmers, you haven't, and if you look back at code that was years old, you have a sense in your head for how it works, and then when you actually read the code, it's like, oh, it's actually much more complicated than I remember. And then it's like, oh, okay, and here is the years of refinements we've done to the algorithm. But one thing that we were doing is we actually were basically not using anything but CGC as a price point when back interpolating auction data. So if it was coming in as that rare auction thing from PGX or CBCS, it just was being excluded from the data set. So it's like, oh, okay, that's interesting. For better or for worse. A question had come up of when you want to define the auctions, the percentages you want to use for the different grading services. When CBCS came along and they said, well, hey, can you support us natively? In other words, as like, originally we're like, well, hey, you can always add your own grades. You can add grading services that have never existed yet. Just a new grade, add them in. But CBCS came along and Steve Bork said, hey, can you add us? And I said, okay, sure, yeah. And I'll admit what I was thinking at that point is I'm thinking, okay, the CGC thing is a bit of a cartel. Borak has clearly left the plantation. He started his own thing. But one thing, and again, it's every once in a while you get to play to help the rules of the game. And one thing is, as long as there's only one player in a cartel, they will absolutely control all the pricing, and they will be abusive. They'll be sloppy. They'll be lazy. I was showing a copy of a Supergirl #1 with a cover that's ripped practically in half down the back, that had a CGC 9.8 grade on it. I mean, you can be as sloppy as you want to be when you're the only player in town. I got that one because the guy who had bought it had taken it over to the CGC table, said, "You morons! This thing has a rip on the back cover, all almost in half. How can you give it a CGC 9.8?" And the response from CGC was, "What are you complaining about? It has a 9.8," which was like, oh, okay, so now we know what the true purpose of what they do is. They're not in really so much in the grading game. They're in the, we manufacture a new collectible whose raw material is a comic book game. This one came up with a high grade, so what are you bitching about, Comic Boy? So that one was interesting. I bought that one off the guy just so I'd have it as an example, in case this discussion came up, as it's done about 5 times now in this live stream. But anyway, so CBCS came along, and I thought, okay, well, you're a new player in the whole thing. And so, yeah, I'm happy to add you to the thing. Happy to have more people playing, because more people playing means every one of you has to compete against the other guy, and they can't rape you as badly. So then the next question came in is, what grade breakdowns do I put for CBCS? Because we didn't have any data on how those measured out. And this was very intentional, is we said, well, until we have data to say otherwise, we're going to put you in as having the same worth as CGC. Now, in the time since then, I think it's safe to say that CBCS is not nearly as popular as CGC. I think opinions are hot and contested about who does a better job. I know CGC's gone through a number of scandals. There's certainly a better known brand name, and just the way markets work is you tend to buy things that you're more familiar with. And so I think there's cause to believe that there might be data somewhere in the world which would justify giving CGC a higher percentage breakdown. So in other words, if I had 2 copies of Spawn #1 and they were both 9.8s from the respective services, one of them came from CGC, the other one came from CBCS, might you pay more for the CGC one? I think you might, but I don't think it's a sure thing. That's my read on the data as I've seen it. Now, if you guys have data that would push me otherwise, please send it my way, because we're all about the data at this point. So please, we want to know. I definitely think PGX and EGS are the other guys. They have nowhere near the same market recognition, but at the same time, although definitely there's a who the heck are they factor going on, I haven't yet seen that translate into you would definitely pay less if it was from the inferior slab guy factor. And I think part of that is because when you're talking about the high end stuff, it's so dominated by CGC and to a lesser extent CBCS. I just you don't see PGX copies of Amazing Fantasy 15 flying around too often. I don't know what their analysis would be, GP analysis or whatever. It's another thing I love about everyone playing data in this game is that everyone's always happy to show you either the numerator or the denominator, but they'll never show you both. And so any interpolation you make from, the GP analysis says this, well, that's an interesting point Possibly, but without knowing the other half of the equation, you don't know whether that really connotes to rarity or not. And it also does not tell you anything about what are the ones that haven't been submitted. Um, if I've got, My Greatest Adventure, or Romantic Tales number 46, and it's got a GP analysis saying that we've only ever seen one, is it because only one guy's ever thought it was worth sending in, or because there only is one? We don't know, because you don't have both sides of the equation. So you don't want to go too nuts on assuming. Really, just, I mean, what you want to do at the best is you can at all things is let the market tell you what's going on, and then try to run around to the front of the parade, which is what we're belatedly doing on this move. Is that we're saying, okay, all right, the market did something we didn't see coming, and I think it's time for us to make our analysis of the CGC much more sophisticated than it's been, and try to get much closer to what the market's telling us on different books once you've isolated where the groups are. Like I say, with cheap books, you can still do the drossing to gold trick. We see it every day on eBay. We see it every day on Atomic Avenue. We see it every day somewhere else. But when you're talking about the high end of things, it's a different game. And I think at this point, the data is pretty compelling on that one. So you'll be seeing some changes from us on that. Anyway, guys, with all that said, thank you all for attending. This has gone a little bit long, but I appreciate your attention. And please, I really want to hear your comments on this one. So I'll flash my note up here on the screen, pbickford@human-computing.com. And yes, tell us what you think. I'd love to keep the discussion going on this one. It's something clearly we're working on, and we want to get as much perspective from the people who are on the ground on this one as we can. We see the market from one angle. We kind of look down on from on high on some of the things. We're not day traders in the pits. We're not the guys bidding up things at heritage auctions. So different perspectives are actually worth something, and we'd like to have yours. So anyway, thank you guys, and we'll see you on the next one. Take care. Bye-bye.